Hello, it's Duncan. Last week we worked out how to parse our new items form, albeit with NullPointer exceptions to handle missing or invalid data. The feedback I got from David Denton, one of the http4k developers, was, you can use the form lenses here and avoid all this bullshit. So this episode we'll refactor the current code to use form lenses and see how much bullshit we actually avoid. In the last session we were working on adding items to the stock list, and we came away rather pleased with ourselves, but in the cold light of day it turns out there are a couple of problems. Let's look at the UI. So we have this row here of empty fields to be filled in, and one of the problems is if we now try and delete things and hit this button, then because these form fields were required, the form doesn't submit. Well, that's obviously a bug. Secondly, if we do fill in some fields here and here, but don't fill in a sell by date, which isn't required, and do fill in a quality and try and add, it falls apart. And you can see here in our logs, we posted to add item and we returned a 400, which is a client error, so we obviously thought there was some issue with the post. So let's go and have a look at the code. Here's our add item test, and you can see that we do have a sell by. And down the bottom of this, it looks like at some point I remember there were some things we haven't checked. It says blank fields, but this validation has blank fields in it. That's okay. But invalid date and negative qualities, I don't think we are checking in this validation. Now, what will form be posting when there is no date? I think that's this new item sell by will be blank, or maybe not there at all. But in both those cases, well, we can see we are returning a bad request. But that's the case where somebody hasn't filled in a date, and that's okay, we just set a null date. So really, these should have said that it would have status see other. And the same for here, because we redirect from our form to show the new items. However, an invalid date should give a bad request, so let's just duplicate that one and say that if we were to send sell by of 2023-0099, say, then that should be bad request. In these two cases, though, we don't want to just show that the status is see other, we also want to show what was added. So I think we'll go back up here and duplicate this test to be add item with no date. And in that case, we will try posting blank, in which case we should see an item with a null in there. And for the moment, at least, I think I'm just going to suck up the duplication, select all of this, delete it again, and this is, say, blank date. So we'll make the top one no sell by at all, and this one have an empty string. Both of those should resolve to a null in our item. Well, given the behavior we saw when we tried it out with the browser, we expect this to fail. Let's go and check. And it does. Our validations fail, and our two new tests do. So let's go and have a look at the code. So here's our handler, here's our local date part. And you can see that basically we're fetching the form field. If that's blank, we're throwing an exception, and that will result in a bad request. And if local date tries to parse an empty string, that will also throw an exception and we'll get bad request. So it looks like using bang bang was at least oversimplistic. Let's pull this thing out into a variable. And then maybe this thing as well for now. This is date string. And if we specify the type, we'll see that can be null. So what do we want the sell by date to be? Well, when my local date string is null, then we want a null for our sell by date. When the date string is empty, we want a null. Otherwise, we'll ask local date to parse. And because the date string is not null in here, we don't need that. Should we see if that works? Well, it passes our test, good. And now we might simplify that by making this date string is null or empty, which lets us take out that. Run that. And we're still good. And now we can tighten that up by using a let in here. So we can say $.let, move this date string as the name in here, and then we can use this expression in here. And this whole thing now is going to be our sell by date. Just check that's right. It is. And now IntelliJ knows that this date string can't be null, so we don't need to test for null in here. So we can just change that to is empty. Good. Now let's go back to our tests. And I think that means that we can look at this, and we've done blank field, we've done invalid date, but negative qualities is a thing we should check. So let's go down here. And in here we've got item quality. And I think it should be the case that if we sent in a -1 for a quality, or maybe a quality with a decimal point in it, that we should get bad request. Let's see whether we do. That's good. Now we've got things working, I think it's worthwhile making a commit. So this is fix handling of no sell by date in new item form. And now we've got two sets of things that are really quite a mess. Our app handler is now a hodgepodge of different ways of doing things. We've got $.lets in one place and bang bangs in another, and so on. So we might want to fix that. But also, our tests, well, this one here, validations, is, apart from not needing the backticks, quite well formed, I think. It's simple functions. We're saying, we try a thing, we get a status. We try a thing, we get a status. That's all fine, so let's fold it away. These other tests, though, well, there's an awful lot of structure. It's quite a bit of repeated structure, but it's hard to see what's actually going on. The one at the top, this add item, isn't bad, although a lot of the sense of it is drowned inside this success and transactionally and load and so on. But we repeat that code in these places here as well. So I think if we were to take this stock list and make it into a variable of expected stock list, then we could make a method out of this, which is check stock list is. And now IntelliJ will replace all the others. We'll do all of them. And now we can tighten this up, move this out of the way below validations. And then back up in here, we can inline this, run that. Still good. And now I like really tight tests. So in fact, if we went here and wrote a new version of this, that took a last modified of instant and a vararg list of items, then we could create it in here with items to list, maybe rename that to check class stock list has, and then we can use that, for example, here. So we could say has same day as last modified and those items. That's quite a bit nicer. The next one has same day as last modified and those items as I think there probably was a refactor to do this, but there we go. Run that. Still good. Is it worth trying to remove some more duplication between these HTTP tests? Well, I think maybe they're tight enough already. So that's good. We can get rid of that and amend commit those changes. Returning to the actual parsing, I'm tempted to make this better with plain old Kotlin, but Dave Denton, one of the creators of http4k, keeps on telling me I should be using lenses. So let's have a look at http4k's support for form parsing using lenses. Okay, so here's the documentation. This top one here is the thing we've been using. We've been doing request form with the name of the parameter we want. But there's also this lens API that allowed us to create lenses that know the type and whether or not they're required. And then we can build a body web form, apply that to the request, and then we can take our lenses and apply them back to the form in some sort of way. So let's have a go at that. I think we'll move the ID first. And so we need a val ID lens, and that is form field, and we want to take a string out of the form field. And we want that to be required, and it's going to come from the new item ID. Now the documentation says that we create a form body, which is body.webform, and this is a validator, and it seems that we want the strict validator. The other one is used when we want to parse everything and give feedback about things that are missing. So this is going to have our ID lens, and apparently we call toLens on that. And now that's a lens, we can say apply it. I don't know what this is yet, but we're going to apply the form body to our request. What do we get back? We get back a web form. And now I think we can take that. So let's call that web form. And now we can apply our ID lens to that form. What does that give us? Well, it's a string. So I guess this is our ID string, and we can use that in here. Note though that because ID here still returns a nullable ID, we've still got to double bang this for now. We'll come back to that. Run that. Oh, and that fails. Why does it fail? Well, internal server error isn't good. And it's a bit surprising to me because everything we do here, we do inside this try block. Ah, no, we don't. We need to move this validation inside this try block. Otherwise, what happens when lenses fail is that they throw an exception that is caught and by default converted to an internal server error rather than a bad request. So let's move the actual parsing, which is this bit, into there. And let's try that. Well, still no better. Well, all HTTP interactions seem to be failing. So I think I'm going to catch this exception and see what http4k is telling us. Maybe we'll just run one test for now, and we'll debug it. And here we are. What is our exception? The lens failure, and it's saying content type is not acceptable. Aha! So http4k is doing more validations than we expected. So let's stop this, back to our tests. So now we're going to have to add a content type to each one of our requests. This is going to be header. Now, I don't actually know what headers to send here. So that sounds like a job for AI assistant. So let's say new chat using this. Well, that's not very friendly. Don't know where that comes from. And I want to say add a header for HTML form post to this HTTP snippet. And maybe we'll take out a bit that's there and otherwise confusing. Run that. Is this always going to be true? Always allow? Well, that looks very helpful, and I'm not sure I would have remembered application xwww4 and encoded. So if that's right, we can put it into here. Close the chat, run our tests. But we run the one that we haven't changed, so let's take this out of the way and add this tediously to every one of our forms. One there, there, and we need to do all of these as well. Try that, and we're back to working. And then let's remove that tedious duplication by taking this thing and making a method out of it, which is post to add item root. And that just seems to have messed up that refactor. Undo, undo, undo. Where are we? That seemed to reformat it very strangely, but I'm going to try again. Let's take this thing and make a method, call it post for now, replace all the three that are already good. And now these are all a bit tidier. There's app roots, post, 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 good, good, good. And we can now rename this to be post form to add items root. Run that. Oh, but did I not take that header out? I'm an idiot. Put this here into that there. Yes, I did. So IntelliJ messed up that refactor by not removing this header there. And here. And here. Reformat and run. Good. Okay, back to roots. Now in roots, we've still got this bang bang after ID of string. And that's a problem we can solve with the lens by mapping. So up here we've got form ID string. Now to me it would be intuitive to map here. Say map the string to ID on that string. But that doesn't work. And it doesn't work because map on a lens is a transform of its meta collection, whatever that is. That keeps on confusing me, but we can take that out of there and put it in here. And we'll have to tell it that it's an ID of item. Now if we do that, then our ID lens is a lens of item, so we can just use that item directly in here. Once it's extracted, and this is not a string anymore, it is the ID. However, you notice that isn't compiling, and that's because this is still a nullable ID, and that's because this can return nullable. Back to our constructor, returning a nullable ID. So in here, we've got to say, we can't allow the null, and I guess we're going to put the bang bang back. I suppose at a push we could say, error, can't create ID. Does that pass? It does. I think maybe we will revisit that later. In the meantime, let's have a look at this bit here, this non-blank string for item name. Now we should be able to do the same sort of thing. So I'm going to create a lens, and we'll call it name lens. And that is a string. And in fact, I think there is non-empty string, which we could use for both of these. It's not the same as non-blank, because it allows only spaces, but it's getting closer. So let's put non-empty string in there. And now we want to map that into, well, what did we have down here? We had a non-blank string. So we can say non-blank string of it. Again, because we don't know for certain that non-empty string returns a non-blank string, then this can be null. So we still need this Elvis, but this would be, can't create a non-blank string. And we're going to give it the name new item name. Having done that, we can add that into the form. And then we can use it here as name lens on our form. Which reminds us that we could inline this ID. Does that work? It does. Good. Before getting on to the nastiness of the sell by date, I'm going to pick the low-hanging fruit of the quality. So we can do the same thing here. We'll say this is quality lens. And now the lenses can pick an int for us, which is a start. We want to feed that into quality. And once again, the quality constructor, factory object, this invoke can return a nullable if it's not non-negative. Well, we have a form field int, but we don't have a form field non-negative int. So we're stuck with a plain old int. So we've got the possibility of error here. So this is going to say a non-negative. And this is going to say new item quality. And in here we can say we've got our quality lens. And in here we can say use that lens to extract from the form. Still good. still good. And now going back to our sell by date, I'll put that in here. This is sell by lens, and helpfully we've got a form field, local date, and we don't need to map that into anything because we actually want a local date. So all we have to do is say it's not required, it's optional. And this is new item sell by. And then use that in here. So this is sell by lens on our form. And now we don't need that. Oh, and this is also unused. So now it's nice and tight. Run the tests. And they fail. So what's gone wrong here? Add item with blank date has failed with a bad request. So blank date hasn't worked, and in the validations, that looks to be the same thing. Yes, so when we send a blank date, we're getting an error rather than, I guess, a null date. It might be that we missed the sell by lens out of here. Let's put that in there. No, still the same problem. Okay, well, this one took a bit of digging, and the answer is that this local date here is bound to Spring BiDAM mapping's local date, which says local date parse it. And basically, if we have an empty string, that's passed to local date parse. And you may remember that our browser was sending an empty string for the date if we didn't use the date picker. I think that's a bug in http4k, so I had a discussion on the Kotlin Slack and ended up opening this issue here, 956, with a test that shows the problem. And as I say, I really no clue how to fix this one, so we're going to have to find a workaround. And after a bit of experimentation that I won't bore you with, I think what we can do is we can start with a string lens and then map that. So if we start with a string, then inside this map we'll have a string. And then in here we can say if the string is empty, which is what the browser sends if we haven't completed anything, then this should evaluate to null, else I want to local date parse string. You can see that compiles. Does it work? It does. That's good. Well, I have to say this is looking quite busy at the moment. Let's just take a moment to compare it to the version that uses NullPointer exceptions. That's this one. And at the moment, I'm unconvinced that lenses are winning for us, especially as they're using exceptions for control flow as well. It's when these lenses are applied, they throw, and that's the reason we're returning bad request. Never mind, we'll go on and see whether we can do better. One of the things the NullPointer version didn't give us was what was wrong. But I think the lenses will. This exception we're catching here now is not just any old exception, it is lens failure. So we should be able to get some things out of that. Let's have a look. X dot, and we've got target and we've got failures. Let's just print that and run the tests and see what sort of information we're getting. And we're looking at our tests. And for validations, for example, now we're getting things like form new item is required, form new item ID must be string, new name must be string, and so on. It must be integer. Unfortunately, we're not getting more information than that, so we're not getting the fact that it must be non-negative or so on. And I'm going to cut to the end of quite a long chase and say that I don't think there is any way to do that sensibly with the http4k lenses. What we can do, though, is see multiple failures in one go. So if we go back to add item tests and add ourselves another one, and this time we will remove new item ID and we'll replace the item quality with an invalid one. Now if we run that, it passes as we expect, and if we look in the trace, you see we have an error that says new item ID is required and new item quality must be an integer. That's really rather handy, and that's because we've told this form body all the things that it needs to try, and the form body parsing the request collects all the errors rather than stopping on the first one. Well, it would be nice to have that information to log, so let's see what we can tidy up in our lenses to make this less of a dog's breakfast. I'm going to try a refactoring technique I think Nat Price taught me, which is to inline things first. So what we're going to do is we're going to inline this, and just this one for now. And that lets us see how the non-empty string was created. So it's going to string BiDAM mappings non-empty, And then we can inline that as well. Just check that still compiles and runs. Well, it does, that's good. And now we can see where we could fix this to be not is empty, but is blank. And run. And now IntelliJ suggests if blank. Run. Good. So now I think what we have here, if we take this and extract a function out of it, we'll just give it any old name for now and check that works. Well, it does. Let's go and have a look at it. I think if we made that an extension on the form field, and that means we can take this out, then this would be not spec and not non-empty string, but non-blank string. And we can use that here as if it existed in http4k. So it would be form field non-blank string. And we'd like to use that, in fact, in both those places. Is that good? So far. But I think we can do better because we have a type for non-blank string. It's this one. So at the moment, this thing returns a spec of web form to string, but we'd like it to return a non-blank string. And that will go in there as well. And now we can use the parsing of non-blank string. So we can say, we've got this string, let's try and parse it with non-blank string. And if that is null, then we want to throw this illegal argument. But lenses are two-directional, that's this BiDi in BiDi lens spec. And this second lambda here is the function that's used to extract a string from the non-blank string. So that, in fact, is it.toString. And I think if we get rid of that, and now up here, non-blank string, we don't need to map into a non-blank string anymore because it's returning a non-blank string. So we should be able to get rid of that. And run. Okay, we're getting there. Now though, note this grey here. That's because we're using this non-blank string lens now, and it in here is going to be a non-blank string, not a plain old string. Because of that, we're calling the plain old constructor here, which can't return null. And the compiler knows that, so we can get rid of that, allowing us to tighten up that and run. Well, this is looking a bit nicer. I think the date time, I'm just going to take this thing and make a method out of it. And then take this as the receiver, fix that in there. And now we just give this a name to differentiate it from the http4k built-in one. And I think we might call this null on empty local date. Run that. Good, good. And now we'll do the same thing with the quality as we did with the ID, which is to say we're going to inline this. And then whatever this is. Now we'll take this bit out the middle into its own function. And in here, we've got a mapping from string to int, but what we really want is a mapping from string to non-negative int. How do we parse a string to non-negative int? Well, let's convert that to a lambda. Doesn't work. Never mind. Let's write our own lambda in here. That string, we can say non-negative int on it to int. And if that is null, because the int was negative, then we will throw an illegal argument exception. So put that in there. And this is integer cannot be negative. And note that this it to int can throw, but http4k will catch any exceptions for us and map those into a lens failure. So we're getting there. Let's move that down there. And when we have a non-negative int and we want to return it as a string, this will be non-negative int to string. Reformat that a bit. A little bit horrible. This should be cannot be blank. And this is now our non-negative int lens. And to make it match, we will make it public. We will move the form field as a receiver. And up here, we will give it the receiver. And once again, we can see that because we're now calling the quality constructor that takes a non-negative int, rather than the factory that takes an int, that means that we can't have this error here. So we can remove that. And run. Good. Well, I think that may be as neat as we can make it. Let's just take advantage of the fact that we've now got these failures we can use. And what I think we'll do is we'll create a new event. This will be new item failed event. And we'll just give it a message, which is a string, and that's one of our analytics events. Now, instead of just printing failures here, we can say here with error, new item failed event, and we'll take that x.failures, which is a list of failures, and I think we will just toString on that. Get rid of that and see what that does for us. So the tests still pass, but in our validations, you can see that we get events raised with the message, things like new item ID is required, and I think all the way down the bottom, we'll find new item ID is required and new item quality must be an integer. And we're seeing those in the logs because our application is configured with a filter that finds any of these errors that have been attached to a response and logs them. We saw that in an earlier episode, which was errors or events. Just to show that we called this code, I think maybe we'll go back to our items tests, and in this case, now in here I want to be able to write and has attached error, and we know the event is going to look a new item failed event. So let's go in here, it's going to be new item failed event with some sort of string that we'll get back to. Now if we're lucky, IntelliJ will fill this in for us. Has attached error, take a new item failed event, and it hasn't found it for us, but in order to be the right hand side of a matcher, it wants to be whatever like this is. So this is going to be a matcher of response. Does that compile? It does. Now to implement this, I'm going to see how has status is implemented. And that's has HTTP message has. Oh my goodness, that's complicated. In here, I think I'm going to say we have a has. So this is return has. Now one of those is the feature. And so that's going to take a lambda of my response. Just import that. I guess that one. We're going to call this has attached error. Our response is going to map to response attached error. And that wants to be equal to our new item failed event. Looks like this is close to compiling if we can get response.attached error. Well, here's the code that does the mapping, and it looks like we don't have that property, so let's add it in here. That will be fun response.attached error. I think maybe actually that's a val, and we get it with effectively this code here. So we go to our response and we say get the header with the header name, and if that isn't null, we look up in our table. This should return an event or null if there isn't one. Now we can go back here and import that. Now we don't appear to be able to import that. We'll fix the spelling of that. Come back in here. Now we can import that and see what happens when we run. And we get a failure in our validations with a message expected a value that has status 400 and has an attached error that is equal to new item failed message equals empty. So we've got a good error message when we haven't got the right value, but apparently the attached error was null and not the one we expected. I don't understand that, but a little thinking it through, I think that when we report these events to the analytics in the filter, we remove it so that it's not exposed to the outside world. So it may just be that we have to go back here and say, instead of app roots, say app, and we'll go to the add handler, which at the moment is private, but maybe we could make internal to test on its own. So now we could say app add handler request should have that, run. Now what failure are we seeing? Perfect, we now have an event and we can take the message out of it, which is the one we expect. Copy that and put it in there. Move that down there, that there, and that there. And I think we can make this its own function, which is fun reports all form errors. And that requires the good post from here. And I suppose I don't feel too bad about just copying it. But in fact, if I'm going to be there, I might as well just say, let's not put the new item ID in. Let's make the new item quality 1.0 and make this post with 2 missing fields. Now I don't need to do that. I need to make this into a test and run. Oh, so close. That's very strange, as the messages appear to be the same. I mean, I just copy and pasted them. Scratch my head for a moment. Well, I just spent half an hour of my life that I'm never getting back debugging the fact that I missed the right angle bracket from there. So now we can remove that breakpoint, take this thing out of here, move it into the top level as a thing that might be useful some other time. I think this can be any analytics event, and this is just event run. Good. Just gone a little tidy up. We can make this into an expression body. Probably drop that down there. Have a look. So reports all form errors looks quite nice. And we've got our standard tests as well. Looking back in roots, well, we've added quite a bit of stuff, but I think our add handler is reasonably clean now. In fact, we could make it slightly better, because I think that if we make this a non-strict validation, then we can parse the body here and then ask whether it has any errors. So in here we could say if form.errors is empty, then we give an item, else we can return. And that is now my form.errors, I think. If I'm right, then we don't need this try anymore. And we can make this compile by moving that down there. Reformat. A little bit ugly, but check whether it works. And it does. That's good. And now I think we'll just recast this as if the form is not empty, then return this. I suspect there is a better refactor for this. Otherwise, that is my item. Reformat. I think this can be in one line. And run. Wonderful. And we'll commit that with use lenses to validate form and report errors. Phew. Was that all worth it compared to the previous version? Well, it's a bit more documenting now how it works. And we have got some potentially reusable form fields, non-negative int, non-blank string, and so on. And we are now reporting errors, which is a good thing. But I have to say this was quite painful, and it has taken me a long time compared to the previous version that just bailed on exceptions. But that's all sunk cost. We might as well use these form fields now we've written them. Before we finish for the day, remember we had that issue with the form that we couldn't post to delete because we had required fields. It's quite a subtle problem. Well, here's the form rendering, and you might think the answer would be to just put in a separate form here, wrapping our table row. Unfortunately, HTML doesn't like nested forms, doesn't process them in the way you'd think it should. But what we can do is we can take this separate form out of here and put it outside the other form. Now if we do that, it's a separate form, so it can have its own form action. And its method is post. And we need to give this form an ID, new item form. Now that lives on its own here. I think we might need to give it a closing form, don't know. And we can associate individual inputs with that form by saying form equals and giving it the name. So that's new item form. Take that and add it also to the number and to the submit button. Submit button now no longer needs the form action because that will be on the form. And I should take notice of this yellow here because it's not form action, it's now action. And now if I run our test main and look at the browser, I can add an item. Without a sell by date, add that. There it is. And if I click it, I can go back at the top, delete it, and it's gone. Hooray! Let's get rid of these two as annoying. And I think our work may be done for the day. So we can commit this as separate new items and delete item forms so that they both work. Phew. What did we learn from today? Well, I'm not going to say that using the lenses has been easy. Not helped by finding a bug, I think, with the processing of optional values and web forms. Has it been worthwhile? Well, we learned quite a bit about lenses, what they can and can't do. And we have some reusable code here that I think will come in handy if and when we implement the feature of editing existing items. So that's good. I suppose, as with a lot of programming, I feel that we got 80% of the way there with 20% of the work with our exception-based approach previously. But we've had to do a whole lot more work in order to get it over the line with some better error reporting. I must say I'm quite wiped out by it, but you might be able to tell from my voice that I've got a summer cold, so that's certainly not helping. Anyway, I think this is in a good enough state now to put in front of Alison, let her try it out, and find any issues from her perspective before we ship the feature. Here's hoping we get shipped in the next episode, and if you'd like to see whether we do, then please subscribe to the channel, and maybe hit that like button so that other people can find it. And if you have enjoyed this, then I think you'll enjoy the book that I wrote in that price called Java to Kotlin, a Refactoring Guidebook, details of which are in the show notes below. Thanks for watching.